Stigmata, a phenomenon that many have experienced, but no one can explain. Those who experience stigmata develop wounds to their wrists, hands, head, feet, and ribs, similar to those inflicted on Jesus Christ at the time of his crucifixion. These wounds often come with no warning, and not only do they seem never to heal, but in some cases the wounds of stigmata repeat annually. Visions of Christ's crucifixion and the experience of his deep sorrow are also associated with the wounds of Christ. I'm your host, Carolyn Morrison, and for this episode of Mysteries of the Church, we will explore these puzzling accounts of stigmata. We will speak with members of the scientific community to see whether or not there are answers to some of the mysteries surrounding the accounts of stigmata.
Stigmata is a gift of God. It's the literal transference of the wounds of Christ.
Well, stigmata, I believe, comes from the Greek stigma, which means mark or sign.
The wounds appear on the hands, the palms usually, front and back, on the feet, front and back, and then the side wound.
Occasionally, you get a stigmata of the crown of thorns. Now, the interesting question about them is, are they purely psychological? Are they purely miraculous? Or are they a little bit of both?
Well, spiritual stigmata is something entirely different from the physical form. The physical form you can see, but the spiritual stigmata imprints itself in much the same way, only you can't see the wounds.
At the age of 33, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified at Calvary. He was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane after being turned in by one of his very own apostles, Judas. This betrayal was the first painful blow delivered to Jesus the night of his arrest. Soldiers then brought him before the Sanhedrin, where he endured an aggressive beating. From there, Jesus was stripped of most of his clothing, and with a flagrum, a leather whip with shards of glass or metal, was scourged by Roman soldiers. Each lash of this whip would tear through skin, ripping the flesh off the bones of Jesus. To mock Jesus' title as King of the Jews, soldiers cloaked him with a scarlet robe and pressed a crown made of thorns onto his head. Carrying his own crossbeam on his back and shoulders, Jesus was led to his crucifixion. Nails up to 6 inches long were then driven through his wrists into the crossbeam to support the weight of his body. His feet were crossed one on top of the other and nailed flat to the stake, bending his knees and forcing him into a squatting position. Jesus' last wound was the result of a lance driven through his body, piercing the flesh between his ribs. Next, we'll explore the very first recorded account of stigmata and study the life of St. Francis of Assisi when we return to Mysteries of the Church. Welcome back as we explore stigmata, one of the great mysteries of the Church. In August 1224, during the feast of Michael and All Angels, also referred to as Michaelmas, St. Francis of Assisi traveled to Laverna in the Tuscan province of Italy, fasting for 40 days and nights.
Almost everybody during his lifetime acknowledged that Francis was a very special individual. The kinds of accomplishments that he did by the time of his death in his mid-40s was without parallel in all of Christian history. The vision preceded the gift of the stigmata. And for Francis, the full-fledged physical stigmata imprinted itself on his body.
When returning from the mountainside where St. Francis saw such a vision, he began to experience great physical pain and displayed 5 types of visibly bleeding wounds, all of which match up with the wounds of Jesus Christ.
This super sanctity or super virtue, I think, is one thing that allowed him to enter into a very particular relationship with Christ on that mountainside, so that he experienced the stigmata.
A human being, particularly a very suggestive human being, may, by meditating on the Passion, being deeply moved with compassion for the sufferings of our Lord, actually develop pains, and then after the invisible stigmata, after that, develop what look like large blood blisters.
The kinds of wounds that a person obtains is of 2 basic forms. One is physical and the other is spiritual. And we have many instances of the latter as opposed to the former.
But why, after 1,224 years, did this suddenly happen to St. Francis? And why did it continue to happen to many others over the following centuries? Even more devoted than ever, this man of God, branded by these wounds, continued his mission of spreading the word of Christ and sharing his lessons, experiences, and wisdom with all persons across the lands.
For at least a dozen years or so after Francis's death, images of him that cropped up around Umbria, where he lived, portrayed him as having the wounds in the hands and the wounds in the feet, but people found it difficult to acknowledge that Francis was literally another Christ because they didn't see the side wound. So gradually, after this uproar, Christian artists began portraying him as having a little tear in the side of his tunic, which would display the side wound.
So perhaps this first account of stigmata wasn't so sudden after all. Perhaps St. Francis was blessed by this because of his bravery to be the vessel of such an event, a chosen man, paving the way for others to experience the passion of Christ and the divinity of God. Or could there possibly be a scientific explanation for the elements of stigmata? The answer when we return. Scientists and doctors believe there can be many causes of stigmata. The visions and wounds, they say, can be caused by carbolic acid, blood disorder, mental illness, and self-mutilation.
The truthfulness of stigmata, I think there needs to be some sort of determination by a church official. Clearly this is, whether it's a physical stigmata or spiritual stigmata, having some sort of deep contact with the divine requires a kind of authoritative pronouncement so that you don't have confusion over something like cutting, for instance, which is a very real psychological disorder.
But that either means that an unidentified epidemic spread across Europe targeting only disciples of Christ for centuries, or it means that stigmata was viewed as a trend, causing many of the truest believers to inflict massive wounds on themselves. But still, these explanations are quite a reach, to say the least. If these were self-inflicted episodes, then why do such wounds never seem to heal and remain open for the duration of the stigmatic's life?
Well, the first thing that we would have to question if a wound isn't healing, is there an adequate blood supply? Is blood getting to the wound? Is blood being able to get removed from the wound? We talked about the healing process involving the creation of proteins. Is the body getting an adequate source of nutrition? Is there any sort of inflammatory action around the wound that's keeping it from healing? In the words, could it be an infection?
Or, in some cases, vanishing overnight and reappearing a year later in the same systematic order.
Even though there are certain physicians that have theories about spontaneous bleeding, medical sciences really have a mixed opinion on it, in part because nobody's throwing the dollars into the science to try and investigate it.
The wounds that we treat most commonly are venous stasis ulcers and diabetic foot ulcers. And what will happen occasionally, we'll get them healed, and then within about a year they'll come back. What we think is happening is that the skin has healed over tissue that's still infected. And the bacteria that's affecting the skin continues to grow until the infection gets to the point where it breaks through the skin.
A lot of the stigmatic cases that are reported, they can be explained naturally, or there can be some sort of medical explanation. But that doesn't detract from the fact that these cases are very specific to Catholic pious people.
If you have a patient who has, say, what is commonly called hardening of the arteries, a calcification of blood vessels, those blood vessels that are affected are the ones that have smaller diameter. Those are the ones that are furthest away from the heart, and those are the ones that are further away on your extremities. So the further away on your extremity, the more likely that that kind of disease process is going to affect the blood flow, and the more likely that you're going to have a wound that's going to have problems.
And most stigmatics are really very shy or bashful about letting the world know that this phenomena has happened to them.
The effects of the mind on the body, I don't think we can scratch the surface to understand.
If these cases were the result of some bizarre illness, then why was there never a cure or a treatment? And why were the only people affected followers of Christ? More when we return to Mysteries of the Church. So far on Mysteries of the Church, we've explored the phenomenon known as stigmata, revisiting that historic day at Calvary where Jesus himself was crucified, and consulting both the scientific community and historians, we search for an explanation. Two fascinating accounts of stigmata were suffered by Padre Pio in 1918 and Therese Newman in 1926. Though both stigmata occurred during the same time, neither host was aware of the other, and the two accounts were as different from one another as the bodies that this was happening to.
Now, as far as we know, Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the holy Capuchin who's now canonized, he is the first priest in church history who had a stigmata, and he suffered immensely because of it.
Padre Pio's account of stigmata was quickly confirmed, while in Newman's case, the Church is still uncertain about the validity of her story.
Probably the best case is St. Francis, who, when he experienced the stigmata, had a companion with him. The companion did not see this six-winged seraph, but he did see the wounds. And the companion, especially in Francis's elder years, after Francis had basically become blind, this companion had to dress and undress St. Francis from time to time. And it's during those instances when he saw the side wound. It's very difficult to keep the hands and feet a secret, especially if one is wearing sandals, and especially if one shows their hands. But there are ways to conceal it. Long sleeves, for instance, or gloves. So that it's very easy to go through life without letting anybody know that this phenomena has visited them. On the other hand, there are those who, for all of their abilities to conceal their wounds, word gets out. This is evident in the case of Padre Pio. Padre Pio is one of those stigmatics of the 20th century who, when he received the gift, almost immediately his fame spread throughout Italy and southern Europe. This made his contemporaries very cautious. as a Capuchin friar, he would have been able to travel around Italy to preach, but no bishop in Italy allowed Padre Pio to come into their diocese to do this, in part because they were a little concerned about his fame, the fame that was being spun out of his stigmata. We know today, of course, that the stigmatic wounds that he received were concealed as best he could, but as an active preacher, as someone who said Mass daily, as someone who encountered people who visited his monastery from time to time, there was really no concealing them. And so his fame spread regardless. And of course, today he is a saint.
But how is it that one story is believed to be so factual and the other a fake? In 1911, Padre Pio first wrote of uncomfortable pain in his feet and swelling red bruises through the palms of his hands in a letter sent to Lamis, Italy, addressing Padre Benedetto, Pio's superior and spiritual advisor. It wasn't until 1918 when Padre Pio offered himself as a victim to end the First World War that he had a vision and experienced transverberation, another stigmatic sign. Transverberation is the piercing through one side, forging a union of love with God. In a state of ecstasy, Padre Pio witnessed another vision of Christ, this time leaving him with all the physical marks of stigmata. The wounds remained open and visible until his death in 1968.
He had very unique wounds, open, bleeding every day, profusely on Fridays, and never infecting. The incredible thing about his stigmata is it never infected, open wounds.
Meanwhile, the less creditable account of stigmata occurred in 1926. A member of a large but poor Bavarian family, Therese Newman supposedly received her first sign of stigmata, a vision followed by a secret wound above her heart. The young girl suffered terrible misfortune after a paralyzing fall left her bedridden and blind. In 1925, a year prior to Therese's stigmata, she claimed that Saint Thérèse de Lisieux called out to her and cured her paralysis and restored her vision. Years later, Therese Newman gave credit again to the saint when she was miraculously cured of appendicitis. The mark above Therese Newman's heart appeared there again after a vision of Christ. More visions of Christ followed, each time leaving her with another mark of stigmata. Newman claimed to have wounds on her hands and feet, as well as blood running from her eyes. However, there's much speculation surrounding the authenticity of her wounds.
One of the stigmatas I saw was the fraud. The person was inflicting it on themselves. The other four, the people were absolutely sincere, very devout, and very suggestible people.
I think to try and get a handle on the truthfulness of stigmata, I think there needs to be some sort of determination by a church official. Clearly this is, whether it's a physical stigmata or spiritual stigmata, having some sort of deep contact with the divine requires a kind of authoritative pronouncement.
So the church knew this long ago. As a matter of fact, there was a time when there was an excommunication, an automatic excommunication, on anyone who revealed that they had a stigmata. It was a papal excommunication. So there hasn't been a lot of enthusiasm about this.
So were these people blessed or cursed by stigmata? Which stories are real and which are not? Stigmata has baffled the world throughout history, and though we dig deep, it's possible we may never answer the questions to this strange phenomenon. Farewell, until the next time on Mysteries of the Church.